Slava Isusu Christu, and welcome to everybody. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to announce this evening lecture and to present our guest, Professor Ingeborg Gabriel. Professor Ingeborg Gabriel is from Vienna University, and she's an expert in social ethics and philosophy and ecumenism, and we are very pleased that you are with us. Just to give a very little background, Professor Gabriel is not really new to this part of the world, because as far as I understand, you have visited the country already several times. You also know the region and Russia and Mongolia, from what you mentioned to us. But this is nonetheless for the first time you are. This is not the first time. I mean, the first time was in fact during our philosophy summer school, when Professor Gabriel gave a few lectures to the students of our philosophy summer school here in Lviv. But we met for the first time in Kyiv at the conference which we, the Institute for Ethics and Contemporary Issues, has organized in Kyiv. So that was the first time that we got in touch. And since then, we are in touch, and we are kind of developing cooperation. So I'm very grateful to you and for your time and for your efforts, for your interest in being and staying with us. Professor Gabriel is a kind of prolific writer, and she writes very much in fields which are related, but nonetheless they go from, say, ecumenism to social ethics and economics, and that's also because her background is in theology, economics, and international relations, which provides a very good view and perspective on a whole range of issues. There's also, apart from a very concrete and specific interest of this specific lecture, which is on political theology, we are working here at the university, as you probably know already, on establishing an undergraduate program in politics, philosophy, and economics. And so for us, for the group which works on designing this program, this is also of a great help, support, and interest to have a range of talks which explore the issues related to politics, to philosophy, to ethics, and for this reason, we are kind of also very happy and grateful to have you with us here. I always say that the best way to get to know someone is not by kind of hearing kind of descriptions, but it's rather the very live and immediate and direct contact with someone. So I think that, in fact, the best introduction to who Professor Gabriel is would be the lecture and questions and answers which would follow that lecture. So with no further ado, I would very kindly invite you to the floor, and the floor is yours. So we're welcoming you, Professor Gabriel, at Ukrainian Catholic University.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and for the organization of this event at the Catholic University of Lviv. It is really a great joy and an honor for me to speak here and to present some ideas. And at the university, and I want to say this very honestly, where I'm really impressed with the vision and the drive and the intention to bring good academic culture and good critical thinking to Ukraine. So it is we have seen that during the last day, during the talks, and I'm grateful for being able to participate in this. Questions of politics are mostly treated in a pragmatic way. At best, there is a philosophical reflection of political traditions. I want this evening with you to go about it in a somewhat different way, trying to show that the modern political order, with its division in religious and secular, has a twofold normative basis. It rests on biblical theological ground and on modern philosophical ones, whereby the latter are a transformation of the former, I think. In a third part, I will draw some practical conclusions with regard to politics and the churches. The term political theology has been used with rather different meanings, as you all know, since the time of the Stoa, that means since the time of the Roman Empire. There it was used legitimizing the political order, and with it the actions of politicians. With Christianity, this model becomes outdated, I already say, and the question is posed in a rather different way. The famous Carl Schmitt, the German jurist, with whom I hardly agree in anything, I want to say immediately, has coined this term political theology in our age and said that most notions of the political order have theological roots. And this is indeed an idea I can subscribe to. This is not something so astonishing if you think that Christianity has been the face, the mode of life for nearly 2,000 years. But it is often forgotten because, and I also tell that to my colleagues from the philosophical faculty, philosophers have a tendency, and other people too in this time, to let the history start in the 18th century. So this is the reason why I think, and for me this is also somewhat new, I would like to go back behind this somewhat rather recent date. The more since I believe that the Christian and the modern notion are very strongly interlinked, and that this has consequences also for the political order as well as the positioning of the churches in it. Moreover, and this is also worth reflecting, this division in the modern secularized version has become globalized. When we speak today globally of religious freedom, we have exactly this idea of a religious and a secular order, and this is not only for some countries, it is of importance for world politics as a whole. My inspiration to take up this theme the way I do it actually stems from Hans Kelsen. Hans Kelsen was the jurist who wrote the Austrian Constitution, a very famous jurist and a legal positivist. And he wrote a little essay, I think it was in 1920, Was ist Gerechtigkeit? What is justice? And interestingly enough, this certainly agnostic, positivistic writer starts out with John 18, Jesus standing before Pontius Pilate. And he says, well, just as Pontius Pilate doesn't know what is truth, I do not know what justice is. I cite this because I find it rather astonishing that at this time he, just as Max Weber and others, very well still knew this theological background of modern notions, but in our time it loses its significance, or has been fading, and so I think as theologians we have to elaborate a bit on this. So I come to the biblical normative roots, the paradoxical relationship between the political as the secular and the religious. There are several texts in the New Testament, which you all know, that formulate a new and indeed innovative concept of the political. I state this with this determination because it has often been said that Christianity is an apolitical religion. You can read that with many very good philosophers. I do not think that this is the case. The best known and also most influential periscope is Matthew 22:15-22, and there are parallels in other Gospels, and from which this citation is also taken. Here, Pharisees, as you probably know, come to Jesus and ask him a catch question. Tell us, is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar or not? If he answered yes, he would be deemed a collaborator. If he answered no, he would be deemed a rebel and put before the Roman courts. The way out in the gospel is a famous formulation. Jesus replied, repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. Verse 21. He thus distinguishes here between two realms. The realm of Caesar as the political sphere, and the realm of God as the religious sphere, creating thus a dichotomy between the two that has been most influential in European history, as you know. However, there is another text which differentiates theologically much more in this question, and that is found in the Gospel of St. John, which was written between 80 and 100 AD. That means there was already some experience of the early Christian community with the political power. Here the conversation takes place between Jesus and the proconsul Pontius Pilate. The interesting thing is that the leitmotif of this text is king, respectively kingship. Now, a king is, of course, not a fairy tale king, I always tell my students, but king is the political power par excellence. The text, therefore, also revolves around three central questions for any political theology and philosophy. Who holds supreme authority? Id est, who is the king? How can this authority be defended against others, usurpators and enemies? And thirdly, on what is its legitimacy founded? In the conversation that follows, St. John tries to answer all questions in a rather innovative and also paradoxical way. He thereby juxtaposes two authorities, the political authority and the religious authority. I cannot go extensively into the text. What is astonishing, however, is that the text insists on calling Jesus a king, or the king of the Jews in a certain context, but mainly a king, and he also consents to being called a king. That means as holding political authority. There are two main points in the text which are also of importance for the further developments, I think. The first is that this new sphere is mainly concerned with truth, whereby truth primarily means the truth of life, which includes not only faith but also morals. One has to say that. You say it, I am a king, for this I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everybody who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. John 18:37. That means the essence of this kingship sui generis consists in the testimony for the truth. And Pontius Pilate's skeptical reply, what is truth, has resounded through the ages. It may be the reason that he gave in to political pressure and condemned an innocent person. even though he was convinced of its innocence. That means we see here how this question of truth plays into actual politics. Secondly, the kingdom of mind does not belong to this world. If it did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, the kingdom of mine is not from here. John 18:36. This does not mean, as some Gnostic texts have it, there has been a reformulation in Gnostic texts, which I find rather interesting, which says, my kingdom is not in this world. That means it has nothing to do with this world. But this is not really the point in it. The point is that it is in this world, but that it is non-violent. Violence, however, is what, according to Max Weber, makes up the essence of the political. Political power is violent power. Necessarily, we need a police, we need an army. This is what is the essence, even if we are not with Max Weber, of political power. So we have here two powers put next to each other, one violent, one non-violent. And this is then, of course, also demonstrated by the long passion story for which this is the introduction. In other words, the Gospel of John turns the political notion of kingship upside down. What does that mean? I think it initiated a fundamental transformation of the political, its legitimization, and the way it relates to violence. The notion of a non-violent counterpower paved the way for the desacralization as well as the functionalization of political power. Because political power is no longer the ultimate authority, it cannot command unconditional obedience. In the epochs to come, the power of the sword may and indeed will always be questioned by the power of the truth. And this is what I'm going to show. We have here three coordinates. Yes, I should add, we are just editing a book called Political Theology in Orthodox Christianity, and this is an abbreviated paper from this book. And these three notions I cannot explain here completely because that would be too long. The differentiation between the religious and the worldly sphere I already mentioned. The eschatological tension between the now and the not yet, and the dynamics of history would be a second big point. And the third is the prophetic mission, ecclesiastical institutions, and individual Christian conscience. I just want to say a few more words here about the dichotomy between the religious and the worldly spheres as one of the specificities of Christian culture. What gave me this idea is an article by a famous Orientalist, Bernard Lewis, who works on Islam. And he, in this article, wrote that in the Christian sphere, there always were ecclesial institutions vis-à-vis the political institutions. Even if these ecclesial institutions were fairly subdued to the political power, but they existed, and they were a potential counterpower and a potential threat, which also was one of the reasons for persecutions. And he showed that in the Islamic world, for instance, but also in other areas, this dichotomy never really existed. You do not have an institutionalized and organized counterpower or visible association. This can be said, I think, despite all deformations and dysfunctionalities, despite ecclesiastical alliances with political powers and the violence exerted by the churches themselves. In short, the long chronique scandaleuse of church history. The churches always also were potential and often also factual critical actors vis-à-vis the political authorities throughout history. But the churches, of course, and here I come leaving out this one point of the now and not yet. Also, I consider it interesting, but ecclesiastical institutions, of course, do not function by themselves. In John 18, Jesus stands up for the truth in front of an unjust judge, calling on his followers to follow and imitate him. His prophetic mission thus has been entrusted to the church as a whole, but this church obviously consists of individual Christians who have to give prophetic testimony for truth and justice in the concrete situation, thus following his voice according to his or her conscience. I think this is the reason for the high value of conscience placed in Christian theology. And here I want to insert a historical note. I always found it fascinating that, also to demonstrate my point, in the New Testament there is a lot of other political terminology. For instance, the kingdom of God. A kingdom is a political notion. And I think if somebody came into a liturgy of early Christians and heard that they are waiting for the kingdom of God and asking and calling the Kyrie eleison, that means the call to the emperor, he must have considered the Christians a subversive lot. In a way, he was right to think that these people have a political intention. Anybody would think that if he came into them. And it's an interesting question why, nevertheless, this terminology was never given up. Yes, there was this question, it's not from this world. There is an interesting story in Hegesipp, which I have to mention because I found it fascinating, where a Roman king, I think it was Diocletian, called the relatives of Jesus really to Rome, apparently, and asked them about this text and what their really intention was. So, I mean, this idea of the political being part of the Christian heritage has to be recovered, I think. Even if it then took 300, 500 years, according to newer research, until Christianity became a state religion. And that would be an issue by itself. But even during the time of it being a state religion, there always were two hierarchies. I have to tell here a nice anecdote. I'm teaching also Muslim students, and I'm always presenting Christianity, in short, and okay, history in a nutshell. And there comes that 313, perhaps 520, one thinks today it took a long time, that Christianity became state religion. And there are sitting these two nice girls from Saudi Arabia. And they're saying, well, finally, they had no feeling for the fact why these Christians didn't do anything about the persecutions earlier to end this strange situation they were in and not become a political a state religion. I found that rather interesting. So, to sum up this first point, I think we have here a counter-narrative of power, which relies on non-violence and which functionalizes politics in the way that politics is no longer the highest aim and good, because there is another power which stands over and above this power. And this is, of course, also exemplified in another element I did not show. This is that the judge, that Pontius Pilate being the judge, Jesus as the condemned and the judge of the world stands before Pontius Pilate, the judge. So we have here also the judgment, which comes together with politics inserted. So the text could still have some other elements one could think about, but I now named these only. I come to my second point, the taming of Caesar under the conditions of modernity, a secular transformation. The taming of Caesar, in other words, the taming of political power, is a most complicated process, as all of history shows. And also the church was, of course, all too often ready to give in to the political demands. That means it was only in its best moments a counterpower. Still, as I said, there was this dichotomy without which, for instance, the universities would not have been possible. The universities were called the third power of Christianity a long time. That means after the emperor and the pope. But just to insert that. The situation in the East and the West was also very different. Also, I think the fact itself of separate constitutions was the same in the Eastern and the Western churches. I think it was more for historical reasons than for anything else that the Western churches could, in a long process, carve out for themselves a sphere of authority, which was called in the Middle Ages the libertas ecclesiae. That means they attempted to name themselves the bishop, become independent from political rulers and so on. And it is well known that this struggle for the libertas ecclesiae is also one intermediate epoch before the struggle for human rights. In the 15th to the 17th century, the wars of religions, as you know, were a deep cut. It was no longer possible to have Christianity as a state religion because the wars between different denominations made it impossible to have to base a state on the Christian faith. The idea that led the way out was the secular state. The secular state, as it was first proclaimed in Hobbes' Leviathan, and then in John Locke's two treatises of government more than 100 years later. The first was in 1651, the second was in 1689, became the model for the political order of modernity and the political program of the French and American revolutions. The core idea is that all citizens are to have the same rights enshrined in a national constitution that in a way replaces the common adherence to a religion or a denomination. It would thus not be true to say the modern state is not based on values. It's based on strong values, but these values are secular and legal. The human rights proclaimed in these constitutions can therefore also include the rights to religious freedom as well as the freedom of conscience. This is the big problem with having a state religion. You cannot give the same rights to religious freedom to all citizens. The aim of the constitutional model of state is that believers of different creeds are to be able to live together in peace on the basis of religious equality. The human rights-based constitution thus replaces religion as the foundation of the state. It becomes the ultimate point of reference for its political legitimacy. That means political authority is now no longer tamed by a religious institution, but it is tamed by constitutional law that sets clear limits to the use of power its main aim being to spare citizens from arbitrary and unjust treatment. One of the consequences of this modern secular transformation is the creation of the civil sphere. As the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas has shown, the establishment of this intermediate sphere between the state and the individual in the 18th and 19th centuries was possible only on the basis of these new freedoms rights, as the right to free speech, the right to assemble, and last but not least, the right to religious freedom. It was in this new public sphere between the state and the individual that critical arguments were to be voiced, thereby orienting the political process towards moral goals. That was the basic idea. According to Immanuel Kant, the state and its organs were thereby to be held accountable before the Richterstuhl der Vernunft, the tribunal of practical reason, which was actually represented by civil society. The image of the tribunal, by the way, evokes that of Jesus standing before Pontius Pilate. And it was probably so that Kant was also aware of this. In other words, we have here a transformation of an originally religious impulse into an ethical and constitutional one. The former dichotomy between the religious, the churches, and the political institutions is superseded, if not replaced, by that of the state and civil society, to which the churches belong in a specific way. And the aim is to control the always potentially arbitrary political power. The public square is thus a substantive invention of political liberalism and one of its main strengths. It creates a forum where public discussions can take place, reforms be initiated, and protests can be voiced. However, its effectiveness obviously depends on the willingness of the citizens to actively participate in the political process and also take political risks. Here in Ukraine, you have a very strong civil society, and the political risks taken during the last years were very high, actually. Practical reason and the non-violent power of discourse, combined with civic protest, if need be, are to humanize the exercise of political power. That this remains a difficult and indeed perilous process we notice every day. For instance, by the large number of journalists harassed and even murdered, by bans pronounced against civil society institutions, as well as by the difficulties that are faced by church institutions everywhere when the church speaks up for freedom and human dignity. It is amazing, many of these things we do not hear, but there are church institutions in Africa, in Asia, and so on, who are highly active in this fields of human rights, human dignity, and so on, and who are also ready to pay the sometimes rather high price. I'm coming to a third point and to my conclusion, some practical conclusions, civil society as the main place of church engagement. Vatican II has, as you all know, accepted human rights and with it religious freedom as a basis of social ethics. And with it, of course, the modern order I just tried to describe in short. With this went the idea that the church has now not so much anymore to interact with the political power, but mainly in civil society. I think Ukraine can nearly be an example there how that functions, because in our countries this in many ways is still a desideratum. I think we have not really taken this change, this turn very well for a variety of reasons we can discuss if you are interested. I think today there are 3 points I would like to stress. The first point is the focus on the moral foundation of institutions. Modernity has, or modern political institutions, try to create a just system through institutional means. That means through a constitution, through a system of checks and balances, through the division of legal, executive, and judiciary powers, so as to prevent the abuse of powers and political corruption. Of course, that means we have complicated systems of institutions. But we have sometimes forgotten that these institutions cannot replace morals and ethics. We have discussed that today also actually with regard to this program. And this holds true neither for the rulers nor for the ruled. That means morals remain the foundation of political institutions. And I think a lot of the disgruntlement we have today in our societies has to do with the disappointment that these institutions, these organizations don't work anymore as perfectly as we have hoped that they would, because people are just doing whatever they like in a fairly arbitrary way. And institutions cannot be effective without this moral basis. I think here the churches have really a task to bring this point through and to educate personalities. The second thing is, here one could of course add the whole question of ethics, what ethics is, etc. The second question is the active participation in civil society. The modern political model has a lot of advantages for the churches. Also, it has for a long time been contested. The main advantage, obviously, is that one can speak up without having to fear repression and prison and similar things. But of course, that does not mean yet that one is able to speak up. We all know how difficult it is to speak up in a modern society, how much competence, knowledge, etc. it needs. It also is rather difficult to engage with different actors in a civil society, that these actors having rather different aims, overlapping aims, etc. All of them, or most of them, being secular actors. Also, this needs a change of mindset. And I think we still have in our countries, and that would be an interesting discussion here, how that looks in Ukraine, a problem as a Catholic Church to engage in this civil society. Too long we have been used to have a monopoly, and we always become very displeased if somebody has a completely different opinion. How can you have such a stupid opinion? So this is a new technique. And here I come in with a third point, and I think it's 3/4 of an hour already, and I will slowly close. I think the present Pope is doing that admirably well through what I call the method of dialogue. In other words, how would I describe this method of Pope Francis, which you can read in Laudato Si? He doesn't speak much about ethics, interestingly. A couple of things he says, but he invites people who are working on the same issues for dialogues. And he does that on issues like human trafficking, slave trade, it's sometimes called, on ecological issues, on interreligious dialogue, and so on. A lot of these dialogues are going on in the Vatican, and I have had a lot of feedback from people who have been there, very often who had nothing to do with religion, like a Finnish lady from the UN in Vienna who is responsible for the human trafficking unit. And she was very enthusiastic about her visit to the Vatican, because she said really there are like-minded people from all different walks of life, from all different kinds of institutions, and we had good conversations, and we really can make a movement, a moral movement against human trafficking, for a better environment, and so on. That means a religious truth message is, of course, also transported with this, the Pope being present at quite a few of these meetings, I heard. So this is exactly this non-violent power, this non-violent moral authority that stands up for a truth that has to do with human dignity. That helps, that of course requires also that we are ready to learn from the other, as Gaudium et Spes says, but that makes the Catholic Church part of the agenda setting in these social ethical questions. We have done similar things. I was for many years Director of Justice and Peace in Austria, and I always was very happy to see that people from completely different institutions, from Le Legio Maria and from the Socialist Women's Organization and what have you in Austria, came together, for instance, to discuss the question of human trafficking, which is a terrible question, but we just came from a meeting on migration, so migration would be another issue, and so on. I think that the Catholic Church in this way can play the role of a civil society actor very effectively in this modern political order. And taking also based on the normative biblical teachings. I finish here because I don't want to speak any longer, and thank you for your attention. And of course, please, any questions you want to ask?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your reflections. And I would suggest please raise your hands and also introduce yourself. I already saw two hands, Yuri Pilisny in Petrongsa.
Well, thank you very much for this conference. I have two questions, actually. First one, you mentioned that the modern time is marked by the fact that the society became secular and the church, or rather religion and faith, can no more tame the Caesar. Mm-hmm. And what can tame the Caesar is now are values. But those values are secular, but still values. And I have a question related to the fact that religion and faith is something transcendent to our world. And secular values is something inherent for our society. Therefore, the society is taming the society. Why should we obey to what we decided that should tame us? We lost the source of a taming, the source which do not belong to ourselves. Is there not a problem?
Well, there are many problems in that. I mean, perhaps I should say something first. The term secular is, of course, one of the most debated terms there is. And I normally make a distinction, and that I think has proved helpful, between three forms of secular. The first one is secularization of the society. Simply said, empirically, less people go to church, yeah? Would be one. Perhaps you don't have that in Ukraine, in other. The second one would be secularism, which is an ideological attitude. The secular, showing the philosophy of history, in the end, we will end up in, like Kant, in a completely secular society, and this is good so, to say it very simply. Yeah? And the third one is the secular state. As I said, the secular state is a state, the advantage of which is that you can have different religious groups at the same level. And we have to acknowledge, and here I'm with the question of learning from the other, that this secular state and the civil society actors in it are also fairly effective in taming Caesar. We have a lot of what I would call immanent humanist groups in all countries today, which are acting for political values. So this is not impossible. We can then ask about the limits of an immanent humanism. And this was also the reason why I presented the biblical texts. I would say that a Christian humanism has deeper roots. But that doesn't mean that an immanent humanism is impossible. That, I think, also the empirical evidence would not allow us to say. If I say, to bring it again on a very simple level, a human being has dignity because it is a human being, that would be, of course, a circular approach in a way. Huh? Whereas if I say a human being has dignity because it is an image of God, I have another layer below. Yeah? But still, many people today act on the basis that human dignity is a good thing, even if they are not believers. So we have here another, the possibility to tame Caesar, to remain in the picture, also by, I think, by people who do not have the Christian faith. I think maybe, and I'm grateful that you gave me the possibility to clarify this, because this question on the secular is, of course, one of the most difficult debates today. And what I meant was the secular state.
And the second question is about the role of the church in the civil society. You mentioned this as a third part of your presentation. But I think that that depends on what kind of secular society we have. Because if we take one model of the secular society where there is no place for religion or for the churches in the public squares, then there is no role for the church. Let's say, I guess that is quasi-French situation. And we can have another model where each religion or each church can have its place in the public squares, and we can speak about the role of churches or role of faith or religion.
Definitely, yeah, thank you. I mean, there are different models in different countries. I mean, there is the American system also, there is the Austrian cooperative system that have grown historically, that give more or less possibilities. Also, I think also in France, the church has, again, more possibilities than, for instance, in a communist state. Yeah? But there are differences there, and I would really say we have to work towards a cooperative model, like in Austria, in Germany, and this is a certain struggle at the moment, but that would be another topic. Yeah.
Dr. Husak, I am docent of the chair of philosophy here at the Catholic University. I would have some remarks or clarifications by returning to the main questions on the poster. What to render to Caesar, and what to render, what belongs to Caesar. May I draw something on the whiteboard? May I use it? Caesar is a proper name of Gaius Julius Caesar, and all successors of him were named by him, after him, and Gaius Julius Caesar, after his return from the Hellenistic Egypt, declared himself to be an incarnated god. Jupiter Julius, incarnated Jupiter. He saw this way of worship of the state authority in the Hellenistic Egypt. He liked it. And so he brought it to the Rome. He was killed for it, for this pretension. But all his successors were not only named after him as Caesars, but put forward the same pretension to be worshipped as divinities. Pretension of divinization of the Caesar, of the state authority. Therefore, in the famous dialogue pictured in the Gospels between Jesus and Pharisees, pay taxes and to Caesar or not to pay taxes to Caesar, Jesus answers it in the negative way. Many people think that it is a positive statement. You should render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Caesar puts forward the pretension of the sacral sphere. And by answering the question of Pharisees, these answers don't grab it. You shall not have a pretension on the sacral sphere. Then remains the second sphere, the profane. Through F, Latin word, profane sphere. It seems that the whole profane sphere belongs to Caesar and should be rendered to Caesar back. But here we should pose the second question. What is due to Caesar and what is undue to Caesar? It's the same question as what is just. Which Caesar's pretension on the profane sphere is just pretension and which is unjust? For instance, the taxes. Yes, you shall pay taxes to Caesar. In which amount? Which are due taxes or just taxes, and which are not just or due taxes. Many people revoke here the letter to the Romans of St. Paul, the chapter 13, by quoting that all state authority comes from God and you should pay taxes to the state authority and so on, and render reverence and so on, and obedience to the state authority. But in the same letter, in the Greek original, is written, "Uk estin exousia eime apototeu." There is not an authority if it comes not from God. In both cases, in Gospels and in St. Paul letter, it is a negative text which delimitates the state, limitates and delimitates the state power and pretension of Caesar on the sacral sphere and on what is unjust and undue in the profane sphere. Thank you.
Thank you. I do not see a question. You didn't ask a question, no?
It was not a question. It was a complimentary remark.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, a few more questions.
Andrei Kostyuk, I'm teaching here social ethics and human rights theory on another program. And my question relates to this dichotomy of two administrative structures in the medieval world and one structure, so to speak, in the Muslim world, which we have since the beginning of this religion and basically until now in the Muslim states. It was very interesting for me, basically, you're stressing that there were never in the Orbis Christiana the single authority, so the clergy was never the absolute authority, and it can be more or less influential, but it was never the only ruling. There was always the emperor's line of administration, the state one. But my question relates more to what is your experience and what is now the European understanding of how Muslim world in today's secular or human rights oriented society can develop, because in their history there were always attempts that Islam is a state religion, and as soon as the majority Muslim population has a possibility to decide, as in Turkey now or a few years ago in Egypt, they would rather vote for parties who try to establish, even if it's democracy, then democracy shall be the Sharia democracy. If it's a kingdom, then of course it shall be a Sharia kingdom, etc., etc. If it's a republic, or Muslim Republic of Iran, it's a completely interesting form of governance, but it's definitely Islam oriented in a sense that the last word has the religious leader of the country. Yeah? And we remember the Cairo Declaration of the Muslim states of 1990, I believe, where they say that human rights are a good thing, but of course they shall be not just compatible, but somehow subordinated to Sharia, of which is the constitutional, so to speak, arrangement of any Muslim country. Do you think it can change somehow? What shall change? Muslim understanding shall change. We shall give up the attempts to make secular states there, as Atatürk was trying in Turkey. Or what do you think is the source of dialogue between post-Christian world, the secular states of Europe, and still Muslim states of Middle East in this respect? What is the Caesars and what is God's in this respect?
Well, thank you for your question. I think there one would have really to invite a specialist on the subject. I mean, I can just say a few glimpses of what I have to do with. Of course, there is also a debate going on in many majority Islamic states on questions of religious freedom, on questions of the secular state, which whereby the word secular is not uninteresting, is not being used because it would mean the godless state. And there one says, no, that is not a good word. One uses normally the word the civil state. So what is the outcome going to be? How this model can be incorporated into other cultures? That, for me, is one of the central questions today, and which we would really have to discuss. I mean, of course, the Catholic Church has managed with Dignitatis Humanae to find a compromise there. We have discussed that also for a long time. And then you have the famous sentence, I think it's in number 2, where you say the religious freedom is recognized as a civil right. The state has no right to interfere in the religious sphere. Whether this is also possible in other religions, and particularly, of course, also in the Islamic world, I wouldn't dare to say. I just know that there are quite a few scientists working, other fundamentalist groups are completely rejecting it, and so on and so on. But one has to see that it is really what Max Weber called an Europäischen Sonderweg. It is an invention. This two-power dichotomy is an invention, and that's what I wanted to show, of a particular religious and cultural setup. And it can be universalized, but it is not something which is universal, if you want to say like that.
I'm Father Michael. This year I have a course of the theology of Maidan. And I'm thinking about the political theology and the Maidan, and the political theology and the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. There are some people who say this church is too involved in the social issues, and maybe they make some very hard declaration of in the political way of doing. What do you think? This is a good way to think what God has to do in the Maidan, to the people of Maidan, and what is the response of people to this internal voice, and what we can do with that reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. To answer the question properly, I would have to go to your course first. I think because I really don't know enough the details. Yeah, I can just say what we saw from the outside, and that is that without wanting to idealize things, but what exactly what I described in my paper was about what happened there. It was a strong engagement in civil society, taking the political risks that the situation involved. I mean, I was impressed last time I was here. I think you told me that Uku made a statement when it was not clear yet what would happen with Yanukovych and so on. So this is the type of involvement I consider actually exemplary for churches, and I'm always very happy to hear when that happens. And I have to tell you a little anecdote actually, that that was already the Orange Revolution, and the Archbishop from Zimbabwe, who got them also into political trouble for this, took as an example for his political engagement the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Yeah, that was already some years ago. I read it in the Herder correspondence. I think they probably did good research. So it's true. But it shows how good examples also spread. And I think this is, in a way, the way of the gospel, if you want. But yeah. I couldn't say more now into the detail where exactly what is too much or not too much or so.
From me also comment, because we just returned from the Ecumenical Social Week roundtable, and one of the things that we heard there was the presentation of the Caritas person, right? One of the directors of Caritas, who was saying about the initiatives they're doing for people who escaped the war in the East. And I actually, well, many UKU students also go there and rebuild houses for those people, and it happens all the time. I'm thinking about what you said, and I think one of the important things that Christians have to do today is actually doing things like that. Because if you are not doing things like that, how are you actually showing your Christian identity? Where do you see God's image if you don't see it in the face of people who are in need? If you don't speak for your fellow citizens, if you are not sacrificing your time and efforts for them, then where else are you showing your Christian identity? In beautiful gowns, or in loud singing, or what is that really space for Christian to be Christians? So thank you for that presentation. And I'm thinking about Ukraine. I also just want to make a remark about what we see from Orthodox Christians. We have that conflict inside, because one of the comments that we hear from Russian Orthodox Church, which of course we understand the background behind that church, is that if you're a Christian, you should stay away from all that political games, right? But how can you stay from the problems of the people, from people without roof on their or people without a possibility to survive? That is impossible. And I'm thinking we should just transfer political into more wide than just institutions. Political is going behind institutions. Political is about being in community. So in that church, in that sense, church cannot be outside of politics, at least today.
Thank you. But this is, perhaps to add still here, this is of course one also one of the strengths the Catholic Church has developed, and I think this development has to do with history more than with anything else, because it was in Europe for many years, 100 years, the only functioning institutions, whereas the Orthodox Church in Byzantium always had functioning institutions on the side. So it's a different history, which sometimes is then given a theological meaning. I think it just has a historical background. But I know also I was very surprised when my Orthodox friends the first time said, well, this is a part of your power striving identity and so on. So there we really have a different interpretation. And it would be interesting to go into this debate also ecumenically.
If I may just add one thought or thing. Well, it's very simple, maybe overly too simple question, but I'm kind of thinking as you speak as to what that public space is, and what exactly specifically could that mean for the church, for example, to participate in that space. I mean, some examples were mentioned, maybe like humanitarian help, for example. Is this? I mean, participation in the public space. I mean, church used to be very active in education world. Is this something which we would like church to do more or more actively and creatively, for example? This is probably not, as we mentioned, just kind of pure political life, in the sense that you support some or not support some, and you're kind of engage yourself in political debates and everything. So this is probably not the way we would like church to be member of that political space. I mean, and also if you think about the modern communication technologies and capacities, again, my question would be, I mean, they certainly shape, at least structure that public space. So how would you expect church to engage herself into this communicative space, which is, I mean, has incredible capacities, opportunities, and probably also certain unexpected problems or challenges which we may not be even quite aware of, given the technology, I mean, massive growth of technologies. So, yeah, and how would you comment on this as to how, what are the ways, for example, in the modern world, I mean, given the way we grow, developed, and given the challenges for church to show itself, to present itself into that public space and domain?
Thank you for that question. I mean, first, terminologically, I would say, of course, education contributes to politics. The way we were discussing that today very much with this program. But the other thing is, and here I will just say my personal impression and experience also, there would be a great need for all kinds of initiatives in the media, in other areas that have to do with value in our societies. In Austria, the Catholic Church was, and to a certain degree also is, still fairly strong. but it simply does not go enough, I think, into the public sphere, taking in all the difficulties, of course, that entails. Somebody says this is wrong, somebody says you should have another position. That means the whole plurality that is also part, of course, of the public discourse, then also shows in the church. And I think we still want to preserve the image of having all the same opinion. And this is not possible in the public sphere. But still, it would be good to have much more of this from television programs, etc., etc. And I was always a bit surprised that the Catholic Church does not use this space enough, I think, in many ways. With the many people it has, also with the financial resources it has, and so on. Because in my impression always was, wherever I spoke, and I spoke a lot in all kinds of fora, that people long for that. And there I'm coming perhaps a bit back to this question of immanent and Christian humanism. We have in our societies, and I can't say now Ukraine, but Austria, Germany, in this area, a lot of people who are still open for ethics, for questions of values, for all of these things. They're not faithful Christians. They find all of that a bit too complicated or what have you, but they're open for this. And that means you can form alliances with them. You can present them with ethical issues and so on. And they will respond positively. And then you have, of course, also the faith dimension, which you don't have to hide. I mean, I don't hide it, because I say, and sometimes I argue also theologically. I just think that this is using the opportunities of a liberal society, and to said the other way around, what belongs to the political, what came to my mind was whatever the communists did not allow the Christian churches to do. Yeah, because they had an absolute demand on the political, and they would not have allowed that. So I think it's a good way things you are using here, and I have the impression the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is a very lively church, and to use this potential that is there to reach out to others and to be present in this sphere, I think is also the best service one can do to faith today. That's my conviction. That's why I'm in this area, because this is where people start to listen, and that's what I wanted to say also with these examples of the Pope. All people from all kinds of areas are accepting the way he does. He does it. He brings ethical issues on the agenda, and that, for instance, in our country, gave the Catholic Church a completely new standing. I don't know whether I answered your question. It's a huge question. One could, of course, go on and on with it.
I would be happy to thank you for your presentations and reflections and the very sincere mode and modality of presentation, which you did. And I'm sure and confident that we will be continue our cooperation. And I think that it's very helpful, and it's very much needed for us to have a kind of larger and global view and context and understanding of what's going on. We are not that far geographically, but still, I mean, there are all sorts of cultural, linguistic, and other differences, and sometimes those differences may be an opportunity, I think, for us to better see and approach reality. The moment we get together and have a conversation and discussion, I think that we are there's certain potential which we might uncover and discover unexpectedly even for ourselves. So this is why I'm very much grateful for your presentation. Thank you so much, and thank you all for. It's not overly late, but it's not. It's already 7 o'clock, almost 7 o'clock in the evening, and you're still here with us. That's a very good sign of your interest and commitment, and I appreciate that very much. So thank you all for coming and for participating in this class and lecture and discussion. All the best to you, and stay tuned. We'll be having other guests and professors with us at UKU. Thank you so much.
Thank you.